social work. Why did you choose that?
It's funny, it's been a long time, it feels like, since anyone's asked me that. And again, I think that helping piece, I really wanted to do community-based work. I think I did some volunteering before I started my MSW program. I also had taken Spanish through high school and college and had lived in Spain and knew that I wanted to use the Spanish language, and I also wanted to do good. And so the social work in the Boston area, which is where I grew up and then studied, I knew that I would be able to put that language skill to use, and then did end up working mostly with Spanish-speaking community. We all have challenges in our childhood, things that make us feel like maybe we could do better or be better people, and I think being able to help other people helped me feel better about myself.
What did you study as an undergrad degree?
Psychology and Spanish, so sort of that same track.
So there you go.
I stuck with the same thing.
So what was your first job then with your degrees?
So I worked in Boston and had an internship when I was in my social work program. And it was at one of Cambridge City Hospital's satellite clinics. And back in, what was that, the early 90s, the whole be out in the community and focus a satellite clinic on a certain community resulted in me, because I spoke Spanish, being able to do work in the Spanish target clinic. And I was a social worker, mostly with young pregnant women who were undocumented Spanish-speaking immigrants. And that turned into a part-time job when I graduated. And I also ended up having another part-time job working for, it's a 0 to 3 program, different states call it different things. Here in Massachusetts, it's called early intervention. So from the social work end, I was doing home visits with people at risk, where the 0 to 3-year-olds were at risk for certain reasons. So using my Spanish. I actually learned about research in undergraduate and graduate school. And actually, it didn't really come later because I was involved in research in college, being a research assistant for one of the professors doing research on rats, which I did once and I will never do again. After staying up all night one night, watching a rat come out from anesthesia after it had, as I recall, a hole drilled into its skull so they could glue a cannula to it to insert some sort of drug. Anyways, that was probably the first time I was exposed to any sort of research. And then after that, I was in, it was a couple years later, I ended up being a research assistant when I was living in Baltimore, doing work with people with substance abuse problems and mental health problems, so dual diagnosed individuals.
And before you were ever involved in research, did you have any idea of what that meant? Research was, the importance of it, or how it...
Well, I was lucky enough to take one of George Annis's classes at BU, and so learned about research subjects and very cursorily the Belmont Report, but from a very academic viewpoint and very removed. And I also grew up being informed through my high school curriculum about the Holocaust and the things that happened. So probably a little bit of a negative perspective I had about research when I was younger. And then before I started working in the IRB world, I actually was in at least one research study at one of the institutions in one of the cities I worked in. And even then, I think I probably didn't understand. I did it because I wanted the money. So
can you describe that, or do you want to? Or care to?
What it was an early phase vaccine research study for rotavirus. And it was at a very prestigious, well-known institution. And I wasn't working at the time. I was applying for jobs, and it paid a couple $100. So I went in, and they gave me whatever it was that was one of the doses of the vaccine that later turned out to be the wrong one. And I actually moved away, and after I moved away, I got a letter in the mail from, assumedly, the IRB, because at that point I had no idea about what IRBs were, wanting to explain to me their error, their adverse event, it would have been called an unanticipated problem or serious noncompliance, I guess, in my current lingo. So that was probably my my first sort of, as a aware adult, exposure to research.
When do you feel you started to truly understand what research was about?
Probably that job, which actually came shortly after being in the research study. I was working at an institution where I was working with a psychologist and a psychiatrist, and we were doing research that involved both interviewing folks about very sensitive topics about risk behavior for HIV and also sample collection from those individuals. And because I had been transitioning from social work to more this research assistant, I felt like it was more of a public health type job. My social worker self was very sensitive about these folks that I was recruiting and then going to be having sit in a room with me and have to ask them these very personal, private questions. And I think that's the first time that I realized the importance of a consent process. And it didn't have anything to do with knowing about the Belmont Report and beneficence, justice, and respect, because I didn't learn that until another 4 or 5 years later. But it just came from recognizing that these people, especially because they were vulnerable, because they were mentally ill, that these people were going to be doing something that could make them really uncomfortable. I think I was a good person to be doing that work because I was conscientious and sensitive. But I do think that I was not very well prepared to be able to really explain and be responsible for truly informed consent looking back now. After that job, I moved west to California, and I worked in a more public health practice position. So I moved away from research, from formal research. I really ended up doing community-based, sort of the precursor, I think, because community-based participatory research is the lingo they use now, but I was involved in, I think, what it would have been that, if they had that term then, in the mid to late 90s, or the late 90s, and I was doing injury prevention work in the communities in South LA, and I worked mostly, again, with vulnerable groups. In this case, it was non-English speaking, lower income, mostly Spanish speaking families, doing community interventions, but layered with research because there was some analysis of reducing risk and reducing injuries that went along with the community interventions I was doing. And then I started to hear about IRBs because what I did for work involved my higher-ups having to get IRB approval, but I still had no concept of what I was doing and how that related to an IRB office and getting consent. I started working in the world of IRB at UCLA, and that was in 2000, I believe. And that was when I first heard about the Belmont Report and, to a much lesser extent, FDA regulations. But the Belmont Report, the Declaration of Helsinki, all of that was when my education of the foundation for why we do what we do in this field started. So that was, 13 years ago.
Do you recall anything about the realities of your job that surprised you?
Oh, the volume. The volume was insane. Something I wanted to talk about today is the transition from paper to paperless with IRBs, and I'm so grateful. There are glitches, there are challenges to being paperless, but the volume of work and how that was compounded by everything being done on paper and working at a large institution that had an undergraduate and a number of graduate schools that all did a lot of research. So I think it was good because I'm the kind of person who likes to be busy, but it was also hard because there is so much to pay attention to in this field, and there are obviously human subject risks that we're trying to mitigate, and so being able to pay attention to detail and be thorough, it's all really important. And I think that was hard about the job. It was also good because I didn't get bored. I can get bored easily if I'm not challenged enough. So that was hard. The other thing, I think, I really enjoyed it, but it was also somewhat intimidating coming into this field, is that as an IRB staff person, working with faculty who have advanced degrees, in a lot of cases it was medicine, that took probably 3 years before I got over that intimidation factor of figuring out where my place was in this work. There's definitely a place for non-medical professionals and non-PhDs to sit around the table and be involved in human subjects research compliance, but I think it was very intimidating for me. I think it was a combination of things. I think, and I've worked at a number of institutions now, I think depending on how it's handled by whoever's overseeing the way an IRB meeting happens or the way an office is run, I think a person in my position can feel more or less intimidated. The bottom line was I had to really learn and feel like I was an expert to feel comfortable, and to feel like I was an expert in what is my job to know, which is the regulations and how the system works, because, again, it took me 2 or 3 years to realize that that was my role, to help facilitate making sure that the people that had the niche expertise in HIV research or research involving deception and psychology do their part, and they review what they're an expert at with regards to the study. And my part was to make sure that everything was covered according to the regulations.
Did you have a mentor or any guidance in this regard? Or
I did.
You did?
I did. And I think, luckily, when I came to UCLA, I worked with some folks who were really committed to educating. And like I mentioned earlier, my first real exposure to the meaning of the Belmont Report, besides hearing about it in George Annis's class back in 1995 or 96, was that the director and the associate director at UCLA, Judy Brookshire and Steve Peckman, were very committed to educating the staff. And so I really learned about the Belmont Report, and I remember having staff meetings where we were really pushed to think about the different principles and applying them, and reviewing OHRP determination letters to really understand what problems happen and what we could do to improve things at our institution. And I think they did that because, just like so many other places, there had been well-publicized problems at UCLA before I came there that led them to really focus on making sure their staff was well-educated. I was at UCLA and then UCSF, UC San Francisco, and now I work at Boston Children's. And I think over the years that I've worked in this field, I think there have been phases, and I don't think it's institution-specific. I think it's just the culture has really evolved. I don't know if I should say evolved. It's shifted, it's moved back and forth, and I think highly publicized issues that happened when I first came into the field, the death of Jesse Gelsinger and the Johns Hopkins shutdown, happened right before I came into the field. So I think there was a lot of criticism of IRBs, how IRBs worked, and there was backlash from that. And I think resources coming to IRBs to help them do a good job, that was starting to happen when I started working in IRB. So I think initially, what I saw was resistance and distrust by the research professional community of IRBs, frustration, some of that having to do with paper systems and not being able to do things as quickly because systems, processes, there was a volume issue and they hadn't figured out how to deal with the volume, and now things have gotten better because, one, paperless systems have gone into effect, and with some grumbling because no one likes change, but for the most part I think that's helped institutions deal with their workload and figure out systems to fix things. And I also think that customer service orientation has really come into play in the IRB world, and the partnership between IRBs and researchers. And what I actually do now more sits on sits in a place where I'm straddling the IRB world and the researcher world, because I do QA, quality assurance, quality improvement. So I educate researchers and educate IRB folks, and I help them both improve. I've personally had to address irate investigators who are frustrated with the process. I have been personally frustrated with the process, like I mentioned earlier, because of volume and figuring out how to get systems to work most effectively. I've seen really great efforts at all of the institutions I've been at to reach out to the investigators and really help improve communication between the researchers and the IRB.
Let's go back to the paper issue.
It was a massive crisis if the copier broke down, one thing. Lots of paper cuts, lots of ergonomic issues with lifting paper files, physical space issues with running out of space to store things, getting things delivered to all the folks that needed to receive their deliveries. At UCLA, we used to have carts that the student workers, some of which are still at UCLA, and they've moved up the ranks, and now they're managers, and would deliver around campus and rain or shine. And
I remember
Yeah.
when the IRB office delivered a dolly to every single member so that we could push our
your carts, oh,
50 pounds of paper to the meetings.
I don't miss paper at all. I mean, I understand, and I remember there being a lot of concern and some resistance to paperless IRB, and people still at the three institutions I've been at, I hear critique of the electronic systems they use now, but I think it's a great improvement, and I think the time that was spent collating and organizing and shuffling paper back and forth is really being used much more wisely now. At UCSF, I was involved with actually rolling out the electronic system and doing the training of all of the different folks that had to use the system, and it was really great. Training researchers, training study coordinators, training the IRB members, working with other IRB staff. And I think UCSF is now they just rolled out another generation of their electronic system.
So put in a plug for the electronic system. Aside from the obvious not pushing hundreds of pounds of paper around or storing thousands, tons of paper, what are some of the straightforward benefits?
For people who like metrics, which I think are really important and good to manage an office well, the electronic systems that are being developed for this niche, I think, are doing better and better jobs at allowing research compliance offices to measure things and improve systems. And the space saving aspect of it is also huge. Of course, the paper still needs to exist from studies that lived before electronic systems, so we'll have paper for a little while longer. But I think the electronic storage and being able to go and look at the work from anywhere as well in this day and age when people need to be able to work remotely, especially in places like Boston where the commute can be horrible, and people who travel. So those things, I think, are a great benefit from using electronic systems.
That's great. You've worked with IRBs on both coasts.
Mm-hmm.
Any geographical differences or cultural differences between East Coast, West Coast?
Let's see. I think really the difference, so I worked at two different large academic medical centers, and now I work at a very well-known hospital, nonprofit hospital that's a children's hospital. And I think the big difference for me is not the culture between West Coast and East Coast. It's more the culture between a large academic medical center and a standalone hospital. It's where I work now is a much smaller institution, but it's also part of a network that includes other institutions through the Catalyst network that are akin to academic medical centers. And I think being at a smaller institution that has one IRB, for me, has just been really interesting to see what we can do because we're smaller. And also, it's because I work at a place that focuses on children, it's really allowed me to learn more and improve my expertise in that part of the regulations and beyond the regulations, just the ethical aspects involved with children in research. I don't think any of the IRB work I've done have I had people that feel like they're just doing an office job. I've been really lucky, like I said, to start with coming to UCLA when I did, and then working at UCSF. Very committed folks, very people that have been very important mentors to me in a variety of ways, both professionally and personally. And now that I'm back in Boston, again, where I grew up, working at Children's at Harvard-affiliated institution, the fact that I work in an office and get to see them on a daily basis and have access to that kind of knowledge base and commitment. I don't see people that are just doing this as their day-to-day job. So a number of years ago, I'm not sure when the idea first started being promoted, the idea that the human subjects research community have some sort of a measuring stick that they could follow and then achieve some sort of accreditation akin to, I always say when I try to explain to people outside this field, akin to something like JCO for hospitals, but for research and IRBs and a human research protection program. So there are a couple of organizations that started doing this accreditation process. And at UCLA, there was talk of applying for accreditation, and I know UCLA became accredited after I left there. When I started at UCSF had applied for and was waiting to hear about accreditation from one of the accrediting bodies. And what I've seen now that I've gone on to another institution that I think is in its third cycle of accreditation, Boston Children's, is it really pushed institutions to have standard operating procedures, to have transparency about what the IRB was doing. And you had asked me earlier about that whole researcher IRB sort of tension. I think accreditation, with the increased transparency that accreditation has pushed for, has helped enormously. All the institutions that become accredited by one of these accrediting bodies have to have a site visit. The site visitors interview the researchers, the research staff, the IRB members, the IRB staff, the institutional officials. Everyone is accountable to explain how their program works, and everyone has to have written procedures that clearly explains how their program works. Everyone has to demonstrate how they implement and make sure all the regulatory pieces are followed. And that's what these accrediting bodies have promoted happening, and I don't really think that was happening everywhere before accreditation.
And have you been through one of these processes at one of your institutions?
I was on the tail end of one and then involved heavily in the reaccreditation at UCSF.
What was that like?
It was interesting. It was a lot of nuts and bolts work. The accrediting entity came out and interviewed, I think it was over 100 people they asked to interview, and I helped coordinate some of those interviews. And it's always, basically you're on display, your work is on display, and it's not the same thing as having the FDA come and audit you or OHRP have a site visit, but it probably feels like that. And there's an institutional commitment and money that is spent to apply for and obtain and maintain accreditation. So while it's stressful, I think it's all for the good of this measuring stick so that institutions can be accountable and demonstrate that they are doing what they need to do according to one standard, so that the human subjects research that's done at different institutions, that research subjects can know that they're in a study that was approved by an appropriate committee, so that the folks that fund the research can be confident that the institution they're giving the money to is following all the rules.
Is there a pretty good attitude among the institutional staff about having to jump through these hoops for this reason?
At the institution I was at UCSF, there was. I mean, it was stressful. It was extra work, but it's a sense of pride to be accredited, I think. And I think in the UC system, there was a push for the different UC campuses to have accreditation. So there was a little bit, I think, friendly competition to be accredited.
Or is there something from your IRB experience that when you look back on it now, because you're more knowledgeable, that you think, oh my goodness, I can't believe that happened?
I think when I first became a manager at my job at UCLA, I think I was pretty young, and I had only been in the field for a couple of years, and I was very preoccupied with doing a really good job. And I think I probably could have been, we're all critical with ourselves, I probably could have been a little bit less of a workaholic, and I'm going to tell a funny story. I don't know, but you may or may not keep this in here. So I think I did a good job when I was working there. I learned a lot. When the staff had a going away party for me, I will never forget. Were you at that party? I don't know if you were there. Well, here's the story. So we had these really dedicated student workers. So this goes to what do I regret, maybe where my focus wasn't always in the right place, okay? So back in the paper days, students delivered the packets. They had carts that they pushed around campus. UCLA is a big campus, right? UCLA. So they had the party when I was leaving to move up to Northern California, and one of the student workers was there, and that student worker told a story as they went around the room about one day it was pouring rain, and he had to go deliver the packets, and they got garbage bags, and they covered the packets with garbage bags so they wouldn't get wet. And they also put garbage bags on themselves because he didn't have a raincoat or whatever. And he told a story about remembering, and he did this in fun. He didn't do it because he was angry at me, he was just being funny. But he told a story about how they went out and they delivered the packets and they came back and they were soaking wet and they were miserable. And I asked him, oh my God, did the packets get wet? And yes, I was horrified that I cared more about the packets than my student worker.
Okay, how about something in the last 12 to 15 years that you were really proud of, that after it happened, where you think back on it and you think, wow, I did a good job, or we did a good job?
Let's see. I'm really proud of the work that I did at UCSF when I transitioned. So I worked on the IRB side for the first couple of years, and then a position came open on the quality assurance, quality improvement side of the Human Research Protection Program office, and the person that was my manager on the IRB side had taken over that role and encouraged me to apply to work on that side of the office. And I was really intrigued by it, and she was taking over and sort of revamping how that side of the office worked. And I worked there for, 2.5 years, and we came up with means to do internal quality assurance, quality improvement reviews of ongoing research, and report back to campus on findings, and do education with the education coordinator there. And I felt like when I left there that, one, I had learned a lot by actually going out and seeing how the research was being done, seeing what the problems were, seeing where the investigators had troubles really implementing what the IRB policy and procedure was that was expected. And by gathering the information and then turning it around and feeding it back to the community and doing presentations, I felt really good about contributing that after spending a number of years sitting on the one side of the table where I was just, not just, but where I was involved in only the piece of churning out IRB approval letters and stamped consent forms and never really seeing what was going on out in the world. So I felt really good those couple of years I spent working in the quality improvement unit at UCSF.
And you still do that, right? QA,
I do.
QI?
I've
So
continued to do that.
talk about how that is involved in the research process.
Sure. So a number of years ago, and I think this sort of was aligned with the accreditation process, the IRB offices were envisioned to be part of a larger human research protection program. And I think there were some institutions that were already doing it this way, but accreditation bodies wanted to see a larger program that involved both the IRB committees, an education aspect, and a quality assurance, quality improvement aspect. And that is what I transitioned into doing at UCSF and then at Children's. And basically what that is, again, not just sitting on the front end and issuing approval letters and seeing the problems after they happen when investigators report problems, but actually going out, meeting with researchers, doing quality assurance, quality improvement reviews of ongoing research, wearing a hat that's knowledgeable about what the IRB expected and how research is actually done out in the field, and being able to do continuous quality improvement as a result of actually going out and seeing how things are actually being done. So the Human Research Protection Program of today includes a component, and depending on how an HRPP structures their office, that may be staff that also do IRB work, which is what I did at UCSF, or it may be staff that are independent from the IRB that go out and do QA, QI, and that work is done both of researchers as well as of the IRB. So there's sort of an accountability piece there to continuously look at how everyone's doing their work and help everyone improve. So not just help the researcher comply with their research better, but help the IRB improve their systems, which I think engenders goodwill on the researcher side, that they know that there's someone making sure the IRB is doing the best job they can do.
How do you describe what you do to your family?
I start by saying I do research compliance work, and if people are really curious, I go into a little bit more detail, like I just did with you about the QA, QI. The simplest way, and this is not what I say when I talk to researchers about it, but I talk about sort of being the police for the researchers. But that's sort of derogatory, so but it's a very simple way to explain it to people that don't see this world. But I also, how do I explain this? Let me back up. How do I explain this to my family? I normally ask people, so have you ever been in a research study before? Have you ever been in a clinical investigation or a trial? And I try and get a sense if someone's ever done something like that. And I have to use a bunch of different vocabulary words until they connect on one of them. And then if I do, I point out, oh, did you sign a consent form? Do you remember that consent form? And then I sort of backtrack from there. That consent form got reviewed by an ethics committee, and the ethics committee told the investigator that he or she had to do things a certain way, and I'm the person who goes out and makes sure they're doing it that way. But I do it in a kinder, gentler way as an educator.
What do you think that the average person on the street needs to know about research and how it is designed and reviewed and processed?
I think something that, if someone's going to be in a research study, I think something that, and I think it was there were the recent meetings in DC about standard of care research where different people testified, and I think what Peter Vasilenko did in his part of the presentation, where you can really make sure that person on the street understands the difference between what's going to happen to them anyways and what's happening to them specifically for the research. And I think one of my biggest concerns, especially working with a non-English speaking population, is therapeutic misconception. And because once the doctor's in the room, people, and I'm talking about medical research obviously because that's the easiest example to give, but once the doctor's in the room, people, myself included, it's like some sort of blinder that goes on, and it's really hard to get certain messages across. So I think to the regular person on the street, if they're going to be in a research study, to make sure that they really have a handle of what would they do anyways and what's different about what they're doing because they're in this research study. I think already things go faster and it can be hard to keep up, and I actually was just having a conversation with someone a couple weeks ago about this whole idea of getting rid of paper consent forms. And because I go out and I review paper consent forms and I see all the errors where people forget to do something, they forget, or they document something unclearly about whether they agreed to genetic analysis of their sample or future banking of their leftover sample. And I had this vision of, well, if everything's on iPads and you can't go to the next page until you've checked off the appropriate boxes, we'll have clear documentation of what people agreed to or didn't. But then my friend was saying, but will people really be looking at it? Or will it just be going that much faster because they can click through all the pages? and know that that file is in their computer to look at later when they want to. So I think the technology could go either way. The thing that sometimes bothers me about the research and the regulations is that some of the politics that it gets in the way of doing the research, and that's probably what's the most frustrating to me. I know I'm sort of going aside, but as opposed to a specific kind of research and how I want to see that, I mean, obviously all the research to be able to figure out who's going to get what down the road. That's scary, but I know that's coming, like the Alzheimer's, the test to know if you're going to get Alzheimer's. That's all coming. But the things that I think have frustrated me most over the years about research is the things like the embryonic stem cell research and the barriers to that because of politics. Research on birth control methodologies and the politics that get in the way from being able to do that kind of research. Those are the things that have frustrated me over the years because of that bureaucracy. I think.
What good things have you seen?
I am excited and hope that the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, the ANPRM, that some of that ends up going somewhere to allow for more flexibility. When that came out, what was it, 2 years ago now? More than 2 years ago. And the Flexibility Coalition that is going to be meeting here at Primer, and the ideas that folks have had before the ANPRM and since the ANPRM, and the way different institutions have started to sort of run with some of those ideas. I think that's pretty neat, and people are, I don't want to say taking more risks, but going ahead and doing more things and trying to be more innovative with how they run their HRPP shops to allow the research to happen. Because I've moved geographically quite a bit over the years, I've found that having this knowledge base has allowed me continuous employment. And because things keep changing, there are always new things to learn. And I think you can take a job in an HRPP office and look at just your one role and what your responsibilities are, or you can do what I think I've done, which is back up a little more and be inquisitive and want to really learn more about the new things coming down the pike. And I think that's what's kept it interesting for me. And I think staying in this area for the amount of time I have, now I can educate other people, and I feel like I have skills that I don't even always value because they're just innately something I know that I can share with new staff, with IRB members, with the researchers themselves. And that's because, again, I've been interested in learning about when the DB gap came into being, or about the ANPRM, or really learning how best to help develop an electronic system so that it works for the institution I'm working at.
If you were going to describe personality traits or a skill set that would be good for somebody entering the field, it sounds like you've just said curiosity. What else?
Definitely attention to detail, but a little bit OCD, I think, a little bit obsessive compulsive with regards to the number of things that you have to pay attention to. And that works really well for me because that's definitely something that I do. I'm really good at focusing in on details. And I think that, like I said in the beginning, I think working in this field as a staff person as opposed to a faculty member with the specific scientific expertise, I think it's important to remember that you do have a role, and again, it took me a while to get over being intimidated by it, but I think that that's an important thing to point out when folks go to work in this field so that it doesn't become too frustrating, because I think that can be frustrating. Feeling not as important, or feeling like you're not knowledgeable enough. Because if if all the IRB staff needed to have MDs, there would be not enough money to support an IRB office.
This is your fourth Primer conference. What has Primer been for you?
Well, because I've moved institutions, it's been a place where I can visit with my old friends. But actually, it's interesting because I was looking, there's always, when you sign up to come to Primer, you have to decide what sessions you're going to go to, and that's always overwhelming. And then you get here and you have to try and stick with the sessions you signed up for, and then you get distracted by things. But you would think after coming enough times and being in this field for so long, it might get rote. But I actually, because there is so much to know, and depending on where I'm working and what I'm focusing on, I've realized this year there's a certain piece of the regulations that I'm not too strong on anymore. And so I'm going to make sure I go and get a refresher on Subpart B. There are such an array of topics to hear about, and the way that they're organized are helpful so that you can try and focus yourself on a track, a newcomer or QA/QI track or Ask the Feds track. I also have been lucky enough over the years, because of the institutions I've worked at, to have been able to present at Primer in the past. And that was a really nice thing for me to be able to do. And people that I've met by doing that. So it's just a real powerhouse of a event. And I'm excited to be back here after a number of years of not actually making it to the conference. Again, I'm not an IRB member, but sort of my pet issue that I've carried with me with regards to vulnerable subject groups over the years, and because of working with non-English speaking subjects, I really, that whole therapeutic misconception idea and enrolling non-English speakers in research, I continue to be concerned about non-English speakers in research. And I'm always sort of keeping an eye on what kind of education is going on at the institution I work at, what institutions practice with regards to consenting non-English speakers, and I don't know what else I want to say about that, but
You're just concerned.
yeah, I think it's something that deserves more attention. And I actually, I know it's a good thing, but the short form method of consent is something that I struggle with. I understand why it's allowed to have an interpreter verbally interpret a 15-page long English consent for a Tagalog speaker and give them a 2-page information sheet. I understand the point of being able to do that. But I'm still concerned about that balance between having the justice principle carried out by cutting corners. So that's my one sort of ongoing thing that I want to continue to do more work in.